The Russian dictator Vladimir Putin is urgently flying to Beijing to pay homage to Xi Jinping, who has summoned him. No sooner had Donald Trump left Beijing on Friday than it became known that Vladimir Putin would arrive in Beijing on Wednesday, May 20th. There are 5 days between the two summits. By the way, this is the first time in history that China is hosting the leaders of two rival powers within the same month. And this is no coincidence, it's a display. But why is Vladimir Putin flying to Beijing? How will he be received there? And what will they discuss? That's exactly what we'll talk about in this episode. My name is Alexei Pechi. Let's discuss this topic together. But before we start, please subscribe to this YouTube channel, like the episode, and please leave any comment under this video. This really helps a lot in promoting the content on YouTube. I would be very grateful to you for this so that as many viewers as possible can see these episodes. Also, subscribe to my Telegram channel, Pechi News. The link to it is in the description of this video. So, let me immediately point out what the Chinese media are writing today. The South China Morning Post reports that the Kremlin chief's visit will take place just a few days after the summit between Xi Jinping and Donald Trump. Putin will be in China for only 1 day. His visit is unlikely to be as grand and meticulously planned as Trump's. 1 day, no state pomp, this is a working meeting. And so, the official version from the Kremlin about the visit of the pathetic idiot Vladimir Putin to Beijing was voiced by his press secretary Dmitry Peskov, who called Putin's visit to China simply routine contacts between Moscow and Beijing. But routine contacts, as Peskov put it, don't just happen, especially just 5 days after the historic US-China summit. And the same newspaper, the South China Morning Post, puts it all as follows. This visit points to Beijing's efforts to manage its relations with Moscow and Washington and to position itself as a key power in a world order that is becoming increasingly fragmented. And in this phrase, in fact, I think lies the whole point. China first receives Donald Trump and listens to the Americans, requests regarding Iran, trade, Taiwan, and of course Russia's war against Ukraine. And in this phrase, she tells him everything about what Xi Jinping discussed with Trump and what now needs to be done in Moscow because of this. Or maybe she doesn't tell him, by the way. That's also possible. Who is Vladimir Putin anyway? He's that little guy running around. Xi Jinping might not tell him anything at all. He can just give him instructions and tell him to get to work. But the point is that Beijing is simultaneously creating an understanding for both sides that, as they say, all roads lead to Beijing. What will Putin and Xi Jinping talk about? Well, there are a few pretty obvious topics. First, Iran. And during negotiations in Beijing, Trump was pushing for China to put pressure on Tehran and help him open the Strait of Hormuz. Well, and Russia is still one of the main suppliers of military technology to Iran. There are missile components, drones, and fuel systems, and all of this still goes through Russian channels. If China has agreed with Trump to put pressure on Iran, it needs to make a deal with Putin so that Russia stops bypassing this pressure through its own channels. It will stop supporting the regime in Tehran and will reduce its support for this regime. One without the other just won't work. The second issue, of course, is Ukraine. Trump said that he discussed the war that savage Russians are waging against Ukraine with Xi Jinping. And as he put it, both want a settlement, but there is no plan. Putin arrives exactly when Beijing has heard the American position. What Putin will say to Xi Jinping and whether it will be a direct counterbalance to what Trump said is still unclear. It's hard to judge here. But it is already obvious that before his visit to Beijing to see Xi Jinping, Putin is clearly trying to increase his value. These missile strikes on Kiev, this record-breaking drone launch, threats to strike decision-making centers, tests of the Sarmat missiles. All of this is an attempt to show, look, I'm not just this prancing little runt. No, I'm a formidable player on the world stage. And here we move on to the third question, Sarmat. Putin announced the test of an intercontinental ballistic missile this week. This is a signal to the West and its allies, and this is already the 10th time since 2021 that Putin has announced the imminent readiness of this missile. Let me remind you, in September 2024, an unsuccessful test of the Sarmat missile left a 60-meter crater at the Plesetsk test site. Plus, don't forget that this missile uses liquid fuel. This creates certain operational problems, so it's more of a political statement than an actual military breakthrough. But in his conversation with Xi Jinping, Putin will use it as a show of strength, like, look what we have. As for the front, because Vladimir Putin is going to Beijing not as a victor, well, even though he tries to look like one. And here's something interesting. Today CNN published an interesting piece, and they write, "For the first time in a long while, Ukraine has liberated more territory in a month than Russia has captured." Ukraine's defense minister Mikhail Fedorov stated, "We eliminated 35,000 Russians both in April and in March." Well, what he means is that the pace remains the same. Russia doesn't have enough strength to continue the offensive. The Ukrainian army is wearing the Russians down. As a result, the Institute for the Study of War confirms that last month Russia suffered a net loss of territory. This is the first time since the start of the Kursk operation by the Ukrainian armed forces in August 2024. On the battlefield, it is already obvious that Russia is losing the initiative. That is why it is trying to launch massive attacks on Ukrainian cities. And these 1,560 drones, which Russia launched in just one day, May 13th to 14th, this is compensation for what they can't achieve on the front line. And as Ukrainian officers say, the mood of the occupiers is in fact changing due to exhaustion. And this is an important signal. Why is Putin going to Beijing right now? The answer is to prevent Trump and Xi Jinping from reaching an agreement without him. Putin is still a paranoid person. He is scared to death that they might reach some kind of agreement without him. Please forgive me for my harsh words, but these people, there's no other way to describe them. Classify. And while the American president was in Beijing talking about peace, about opening the Hormuz Strait, about putting pressure on Iran, Russia was left out of all this. That's it. And now Putin is going, as it were, to close that gap, to explain to Xi Jinping where Russia's red lines are, where Moscow is ready to cooperate and where it is not. And to remind him that this is a strategic partnership without limits, which was signed between Beijing and Moscow. These are not just words. So where is all of this? And in the end, I'll finish this episode with one more quote, from the South China Morning Post. And here's what they write next. Beijing now sees itself and positions itself as the only place where all the key players meet. Trump has arrived, Putin will arrive, and Xi sits in the middle. And this is exactly the main takeaway from this whole week in geopolitics. I'll leave it at that. Your opinion, your conclusions, write them in the comments under this episode, subscribe to the channel, click the bell, and don't forget to like. If you want to support the work of this YouTube channel, you can do so financially with any donation, or with a paid membership using the links and details in the description of this video. That's all for now. Take care of yourselves. Goodbye, everyone.